For SAFM News, I am Anne Musa.
SAFM 104 to 107 nationwide. Leading the conversation.
Mama Kitty, I heard Rand Water talking on the radio about how dangerous it is for people to encroach on their pipeline servitude.
Yes, those high-pressure Rand Water pipelines are under the ground distributing megalitres of water. When people build on top of the pipeline, Rand Water is unable to conduct maintenance on the pipeline, which has a negative impact on water provision. Pipelines can burst without warning. People could get seriously injured or worse.
Yes, people can die from a bursting pipe. That is why people need to understand that Rand Water servitude is where a Rand Water pipeline is located. If we build our houses or businesses on a Rand Water servitude, then we are encroaching on that servitude. They say if communities want to know whether they've encroached over servitudes, they should look for the Rand Water beacons.
The beacons indicate the presence of Rand Water pipelines under the ground. They're rectangular, made of concrete, are painted either white or blue, and have the Rand Water logo on them.
Let's take a walk around our area to see if there are any Rand Water beacons so that we can also tell the neighbors.
Rand Water, celebrating 120 years of existence and still finding new ways to provide clean, portable bulk water.
The Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday.
It's 8 after 10 o'clock. Welcome to the second hour of the show. Coming up in this hour, we're talking finance with Brian Hirsch, and we'll be getting into that conversation shortly. Lots of your WhatsApp voice notes. Yeah, we've got quite a number of voice notes, not surprisingly, on the Giyani Water project issue and just the delays, the fact that they've been promises on promises and not much being done. Well, not that there's not much being done, but seemingly just the inability to actually get things working enough for the system to start working and for water to be reticulated in that area. So it's just another election where the residents are yet again waiting on promises for that water to come on board. And of course, lots of you also responding to that call that we received from Tabani, Bianca Kuzwayo's father, who picked up the phone, called the open line and just said, I want to ask men to stop killing women. Yeah, still gives me chills. Okay, let's take some of your WhatsApp voice notes and then we'll get into our finance slot.
Let's have the conversation. WhatsApp voice notes on 0614 104 107.
Good morning, Sis Katie and the listeners. Kishuma, I'm calling from Zanini. The issue of water it's a serious problem in our place. Presently, there are contractors in a village called Musawa Cross. There are people who have been digging pipes, laying them. I think they are doing it for the third time. There's no water that is coming out. And this contractors has done the same thing in a village called Sasekane. I wish you can invite, the Minister of Water and Sanitation and the President of the Republic of South Africa and the Premier of Gauteng, because these contractors just continue to dig, laying big pipes, damaging our streets. There's no water that is coming out. I thank you.
Hi, Katie. Your show is great. I'd like to defend Minister Senzo Mchunu. He's all over South Africa, where the service providers told him that they are working hard on that thing. We know it started very long ago. Jacob Zuma even went there and opened the sluice at the dam, and then thereafter, I'm wondering why is it still, that thing is still not complete. But I can assure you, call Senzo now. He will be available and he will tell you the truth on what is happening there. I'm Bafana Sibia from Mtonjanin and Nkwe, rural village. We do have water here.
Good morning, SA team. My challenge is on the issue of people who got criminal record but not being sentenced. My issue is on the justice system that people doesn't get jobs because they've got criminal record instead of not being having criminal records if somebody is proven innocent by the court. But then my issue is on that one of people go to court, they got exonerated and innocent, but the justice says you must wait for until 10 years for you to clear your record. Then that thing, to me, the justice system must have to look into it on how can they deal with it, because people end up opting for to do crime because they don't get the jobs. Please, can you assist on that one with the justice system?
The caller just before the news, Tepo, is completely, totally missing the point. Men are being abused, that's true, but there's always an option to walk away. That lady didn't have to die. There are many options. Yes, you go to the cops, there's no charge that you can lay against someone who is abusing you emotionally. But what pushes you to make a decision to unalive them? Nothing, just but pure criminality. So that guy had an option to walk away. All the men that are being abused in their families throughout, and they're not getting any recourse, there's an option. Walk away. You don't have to be a criminal. You don't have to kill somebody. Walk away. Anonymous on the road.
Morning, Cathy. I'm just so sorry to hear what happened to Thabani's daughter. I personally have seen her on the social media and on the news platforms on the internet. The same happened to my cousin last year. She was stabbed multiple times by a guy that she was in love with. It was an ex because they had broken up. But she was not the first victim of this guy. Another girl that he had been dating was also stabbed about 14 times. And before he came to stab my cousin, he had stabbed his father also because he was in drugs. So when he came to stab my cousin, we found him and asked why he did it. And his response was that we should ask my cousin, who was lying on the floor. She was dead. But I'm glad to know that we've done the right thing with him. He will never do it again.
SAFM values your views. Be an active citizen. Hashtag SAFM Talking Point. Talking Finance with Brian Hirsch, making sense of your finance.
Yeah, look, I think this morning is also just such an important reminder of the fact that we don't talk enough about gender-based violence and the impact that it has on our society and especially on families. So, I think that we'll intentionally be doing a bit more work on that, especially given this last voice note. Unbelievable, some of the things that happen. Okay, so we're going to get into our finance slot for today, the ray of sunshine. Are you still a ray of sunshine?
Absolutely, fully charged. Eskom still wanting to buy my energy, but I'm not prepared to let them pay me over 4 months. Definitely not. I want COD.
Welcome, Brian Hirsch.
Okay.
Great to have you in studio this morning. So, Brian, today we are talking about issues that affect multiple generations. It's an intergenerational dialogue that we're having today, right?
Yeah, so very, very difficult. If you think about parents and children and and parents, children and their children. We talk about this generation gap. Who's supporting? I mean, if you think about it, 50 years ago, parents could expect support from children. Today, children are struggling themselves to make ends meet. They've got children who are now studying. If you think about it, many years ago, at age 18, you went out to work. Now, age 18, we hope our children go and study and then start to develop their own lives. And this generation gap, the difficulty for children to support their parents and then also support their own children. And then you've got the sandwich gap where you've got grandchildren who are now also trying to support parents and grandparents. And, no one ever expected people to live as long as they are. So with inflation and money, the value of money reducing all the time because of this high inflation level, people are struggling and pensions aren't keeping up. People who'd saved thinking they're going to live 5 or 10 years after retirement are now living so many more years, and it's just such a difficult situation, and so many what we call the sandwich gap. The children who are supporting both parents and their children are really struggling. We're struggling anyway just to support ourselves and all those things. So all you can do is, you give your child an education, you hope they'll go out. You've got to sometimes tough love. You've got to make sure. You've also got to, in the middle gap, the sandwich, you being the parent, have to also realise that you've also got to put money away, as you're going to end up into that same trap.
So Brian, just so that we're all on the same page, right? I want us to go back just to perhaps starting it off with the definition of this sandwiched generation, and my understanding of it is that you have what are largely middle-aged people that are sandwiched between the responsibility of their parents and their children. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, they are stuck in the middle between the elderly parents and not yet independent children. They've reached an age where they envisaged enjoying the golden years as a couple. Instead, they find themselves burdened with the task of caring for aged parents and simultaneously supporting grown children, not yet able to support themselves. Their responsibility takes the emotional and financial toll and can have a huge drain on their resources of a middle-aged couple. The situation is becoming the norm in our modern world. Even people who endeavour to make proper provisions for their retirement find their pensions now inadequate due to the effects of inflation. And to compound this, medical science has increased life expectancy, but at a price. Healthcare costs are spiralling for everyone, but the aged are possibly most affected. These days it seems that even older people are having triple bypasses and chemotherapy. It's quite amazing, the right to live. So these are all costs that medical aids don't take into. Maybe people haven't made provision. As you get older, the cost of medical aid is the one constant that's going to affect your budget. You can control everything else, maybe not comfortably, but you can control what food you eat. You can control what transport. You can control entertainment. You can't control medical costs. And if you're in a medical aid, I've always said whatever you're paying to a medical aid today is going to cost you double in 8-9 years' time at an inflation rate of between 8 and 9%. Think about it. If you're paying 8,000 rand to medical aid and you're 62, at age 70 you're going to be paying 16,000, and if you want to keep that medical aid at age 78, you're going to be paying, I know it sounds ridiculous, 32,000 rand.
Yeah.
And our pensions aren't increasing like that, because when you get to retirement, there's no more earning capacity. And so that medical aid is critical, and what's got to be done. That's why NHI, when it eventually comes in the correct form, the problem with NHI is there's just so many problems and so many things that still have to be dealt with. But when it eventually comes in, some form of benefits, I can't understand why the medical schemes haven't yet allowed low medical aid schemes. They've still been dilly-dallying all this time. All right. But that's an enormous cost that people need to consider. And so this middle age gap, this generation, the sandwich gap, needs to understand that you've got to make provisions not only for yourselves, but for a longer period for your children, and then also for parents who, if not both living that much longer, one's likely to live that much longer. And, they pay the same for a loaf of bread whether you're working or not. And pint of milk exactly the same.
I'm interested to know from our listeners how much of this conversation resonates with you. Are you part of the sandwich generation? Are you one of those individuals that is living with the increasing burden and pressure really of having to care for children that you thought would be out of your care by now? This would be maybe, from kids that are 18 years and older. And also then the burden of having to care for your parents that are also dealing with the difficulties, as Brian is saying, of the increasing cost of living. And what impact is it having on your finances? And in a moment then, Brian and I will talk about what it is that the groups of this generation, what can the sandwich generation begin to do to be able to better deal with all of these pressures that are falling on it. We'll continue the conversation after this break.
Top Sport with Michael Abramson.
Made a name for herself as the wicketkeeper in a successful Proteas women's team. Sinalo Jafta Karabo Meso, of course, taking over from you and putting the gloves on, and a rare appearance for her. What do you make of her rise up the ranks?
I've actually been following her journey since the Under-19 World Cup, and I think she's got a really bright future ahead of her. She asks a lot of questions, as she should. It kind of puts me on my toes because she'll ask a lot of scenarios. And I mean, that's the beauty of having a young and upcoming keeper. But obviously, she knows that it's going to take time, and I just wish her everything of the best of her career because I think she's a fantastic player.
Top Sport on SAFM. Freedom Month on SAFM. The month in which we had our first democratic election 30 years ago. This Freedom Month, as we reflect on the progress made thus far, we continue to commemorate the selfless sacrifices made for our democracy and freedom. SAFM, leading the conversation.
The biggest public employment program on the continent, the Expanded Public Works Program, is celebrating 20 years, and President Cyril Ramaphosa will unveil Phase 5 of the rebranded EPWP aimed at creating millions of new work opportunities for poor households. Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure, Sihle Zikalala, along with the Eastern Cape stakeholders, invites all residents to follow the events on social media on the 24th of April from 8 a.m. The Expanded Public Works Program, improving, changing people's lives and building better communities.
The Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday. Talking finance with Brian Hirsch, making sense of your finance.
All right, we continue the conversation with Brian. So, Brian, what is it that the sandwich generation can do to deal with all of these increasing pressures? As you've said, these are people who are at a point in their lives where they would have thought that the responsibility that they have would be much less than it currently is. And I would imagine that then financially it means that many would not have been prepared for the situation we're in now.
Yes, for two reasons. One being inflation, and the second is that many families are having children at a much older age, which means when you thought that your children were off your hands in the early 50s, children are still on your hands at the 60s. And when you reach retirement, the three components you need to have in retirement is firstly have a home paid off, you need to have a good healthcare program, and you need to have no debt. And that's not what's happening. So what's happening at retirement, all three things are still continuing. You've got debt, you haven't got your home paid for, and the medical costs are exorbitant. So parents, all they can do is educate their children and let their children get on with their lives. But that's another problem, because it isn't that easy to find a job at the moment. Look at our employment rate, close to 32%, and particularly if you look at the younger group, it's even more than that. So, I mean, government have a responsibility and business has a responsibility to work together and to try and create jobs. And with this, as you're hearing with the different parties' manifestos, they're going to create jobs. Where are they going to create jobs from all of a sudden? If they couldn't do it before, how are you going to do it? And then with your parents, you've got to be looking very carefully at, and sometimes, you've got to have a look at what you are giving your parents. And so often, one mother can bring up 4 children. But 4 children can't look after one mother, and you've got the different siblings. One can, one can't. It's a joint responsibility that children have to get together with and say, how are we going to support our parents? You all have to contribute. You can't just leave it to me. But then we know the unemployment situation. So in South Africa, it's a real issue with this unemployment, and that's why it's so important that we grow our economy. And a lot of the money we collect, we did have a good collection in terms of the last information given to us regarding taxes collected. I think we collected 10 billion in excess of what we were expecting, but we need to make sure that the environment is right. So we put that to use. Only 30% of our 2.3 trillion budget for the year is going to improve our economy. That's less than 700 billion. 1.6 billion is going on grants, on debt, and on paying off all the other issues we do, which we don't get any return on.
Brian, it can sometimes feel, especially when we're going through these challenges as a society, that we are the only ones that are facing this dynamic. But even just this idea of a sandwich generation, it's not something that's unique to South Africa. It's a problem that the rest of the world is facing too.
Yeah, look at exactly. But let me say this to you: we've got a lot of people, particularly in other parts of the world, who are what we call asset-rich, income poor. They've got an asset, they've got a home, and that home isn't producing any income, so they've got that asset. And in other parts of the world, you're able to use that asset to raise monies to live on, and you have life rights to your own property, subject to the conditions that you maintain the property and you keep the property insured. And here in South Africa, because interest rates are high, you can't do that. But in some cases, you've got to force your parents to actually sell their home if there's an asset there, and find a way, do the budgets and calculate what needs to be done. As much as your parents have lived there for so many, many years, you may find that asset needs to be sold, and parents need to be put into rental accommodation to take the burden off this sandwich generation.
What are some of the things, Brian, that you are having to advise your clients around this issue? So when somebody comes to you and says, I can't breathe, and I need help in restructuring my finances, what's the first point of call for somebody who's part of the sandwich generation?
Well, the first thing is, what are you paying to debt? What are you paying for bonds on your home? What are you paying for driving a motor car? What size car do you drive? What other debt have you got? And try to consolidate that debt within the lower. There's expensive debt, and there's unsecured debt is expensive. Secured debt is much cheaper. A bond debt is the cheapest. However, it's long term. But if you can use your bond to finance your debt for the next 3 to 4 years. In other words, you're not actually taking up your debt on your bond for the full term, but only for the next 3 to 4 years. You can bring down costs. And then looking at someone's budget very carefully and very, very objectively, and saying, you're telling me I've got 2,000 Rand for entertainment. I'm saying you don't have 2,000 Rand for entertainment. You only have 1,200 or 11 or 500, whatever the case may be. Bringing your budget within line, and in your budget, you need to say, is there part of your budget supporting children and parents? You need to do that. It all comes back, Cathy. You ask me that nearly every week. What can people who are struggling do? And all I'm saying is the starting point is re-looking at your budget and taking a very hard view on that budget.
Okay. We'll continue the conversation with Brian Hirsch, and sometimes easier said than done, because we also don't want to part with some of the luxuries that we've become accustomed to. So if I have to now go and trade in my car, I'm thinking twice. Maybe that it's not what I want to do, and so it's also about that follow through, right? What are some of the difficult decisions that you're struggling with making, but that you need to make in order to get your budget in line? As Brian is saying, what are those things that you're struggling with? Give us a call so that you can talk to Brian and he can help you think through it and really manage the process, because the sooner you act, the better it's going to be for you and your family. All right, it's time for me to take the latest news headlines. We'll continue with this conversation, and I'll be taking your calls on the other side of this.
Good morning, I'm Anne Musan. The headlines: the Hawks have confiscated cocaine with a street value of 15 million rand on board a cargo vessel after it docked at the Richards Bay port from Colombia. The Senzumehiwa murder trial has continued in the High Court in Pretoria. Yesterday, the Defence Counsel, Tulani Mgomezulu, accused the investigating team of covering up the real perpetrator. And some beneficiaries of the Labour Activation Programme, which the Employment and Labour Minister Thulas launched in Bloemfontein yesterday, are excited. The aim of the program is to empower young people by giving them skills to make them employable. I'll have details on these and other stories at 11.
Taking a look at your markets this morning, the rand is currently trading at 19 rand 22 to the dollar, 23 rand 76 to the pound, and 20 rand 51 to the euro. Markets in Asia were mainly in positive terrain at the closing bell. The JC is mostly higher in mid-morning trade. Markets in Europe are higher this hour. Gold is trading at $2,306, platinum $913 per ounce. The price of Brent crude oil is at $88.43 a barrel.
The Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday. Talking Finance with Brian Hirsch, making sense of your finance.
So we continue the conversation with Brian Hirsch. In a moment, I'll be taking your calls on 086 000 2032. How are you getting by as the sandwich generation? What are the decisions that you are making about your budget in order to make it through every month financially? I'll take some of your WhatsApp voice notes on 0614 104 107. Brian?
Cathy, just one comment. I used my credit card. I had to go to Durban for a funeral of a 42-year-old yesterday, the daughter of a client of mine. Very, very sad. And to the family, they know who they are. My condolences. But, every time you tap a credit card, it says straight or budget.
Yes.
That budget, using that budget is the most dangerous debt trap. Because that budget means you're going to pay it off. And if you don't pay your credit card in full every month, you're paying interest at 20 to 22%. That's enormous. If you consider your bond is at 11.75%, that's the prime rate, your repo rate is 8.25%, you're paying on a budget 20 to 22%. And if you don't pay it in full, it's accumulating. So that is the most dangerous thing. Try not to touch that budget button. Go for straight payment, and then at the end of the month, one of the biggest things people are using, because less and less people are taking cash these days, they want credit cards. I mean, you fly in an aircraft now, you want to buy a sandwich, they've said no more cash, you've got to use a credit card. Stop using that budget, because what you're really doing is you're kicking the can down the road. You're going to have to pay that back, and it's so easy to get caught into that trap.
All right. Thanks for that advice, Brian. I've got a message here from anonymous, it's unsigned, who says, I've been part of the sandwich generation since 2019. I was employed, paying my way, but after COVID-19, I've been struggling to find work, any kind of work. My mother helps me out with some money, but it's hard. Worst thing is, both my parents are set to retire next year, and my sister is about to graduate. I'm worried that if I can't find work soon, then things will get worse at home. I'm 30 now, and it's hard really hard. How does a person go on living like this?
Yes, and your parents would have made provisions all their life for this retirement and what they're going to do in retirement. And as I've said, hopefully they've got no debt, they've got a home paid for, they've got a good healthcare program. But here you've got a situation where your parents are forced. And it's all about the economy. And, I'm just saying, we're hearing so much from all the different parties what they're going to do. Yes, training is absolutely critical. Training people to give them an occupation, but training them in the right fields, in the fields where there are shortages. Make sure that's where you're trained. It's, again, just getting an education, critical. But, there's so many people out there looking for clerical and administration jobs, accounting jobs, legal jobs. But what about all the other types of occupation? The plumbers, the electricians, the builders, all those type of things. So there's no answer, Cathy. I'm speechless because this anonymous caller is just one of so many who are struggling after COVID to get work.
So Brian, what then is the answer? Because it seems to me that we're dealing with a problem that is also largely structural in nature, that it's the forces that are contributing to the problem are not necessarily in the control of you and I to change, but we are just being blown in different directions by these forces within our economy.
Well, government spending is a problem. The fact that we have a twin deficit. We don't export as much as we import. We did for a period of time, but with metals prices coming down, we're now importing more. We don't collect enough in taxes, although we did have an overrun in this last, so sometimes we will. So government needs to borrow. When government borrows money, with global interest rates having risen, government is now borrowing money, but having to pay that much more back on interest. So that's a problem. The secret is for government to try and do things, to use the money in growing the economy. And I mean, if you just think about the cases that go to the courts for the amount of money that is used, that could be used for the benefit of the individual. We talk about the Zondo Commission, we talk about the money having left South Africa, state capture and all that. I mean, that was billions, trillions, that could have been used. So we're there now. But the first priority of the government of the day who is in power after the 29th of May is to see how can we get the economy back on track, how can we get the economy growing, to create jobs for people so they don't run into these problems. So we don't have a 30-year-old saying, I was retrenched at the time, everything was going fine, I was retrenched a bit before COVID and I can't find a job. One of millions, not alone. And it's not that we're insensitive, because you say to me, I talk to people who've got money, but I understand people who don't have money, and so that is the most important thing to get the economy going, to make business, to make our South Africa a more friendly country to do business, and not to make it so difficult to do business in South Africa.
Brian, we've got a message from Anonymous, and in a moment I'll take the WhatsApp voice notes before we come to the phone line. That's just for my producers. But it's a message from Anonymous who says, from what I've heard about the two-pot system to start in September, it's sad that a maximum of 30,000 Rand is what one can access. That amount cannot pay loans and bonds of government employees.
Yes, and just remember that 30,000 Rand will be taxed. It will be added to your income, and so at a high tax rate of 45%, you're not even going to get 17,500, and at a 25% tax rate, you're going to end up getting around about something like 22,500. By the way, it was less. There was discussion between the unions and pension funds, and it was agreed to sit at 30,000. Yep, it's 30,000, it's a maximum. Yes, you're quite right. It's not going to go that far. Just remember one thing. You always have the vested invested pot, which is the amount that you had contributed as at the end of the 31st of August, you still can use that for housing. You can still use your withdrawal benefit, which is probably a lot more than the 30, because the 30 is only 10% with a maximum of 30. So if your withdrawal benefit is 300,000, you can borrow 30. If your withdrawal benefit is 200,000, you can only borrow 20. But if your withdrawal benefit is 800, as you say, you can only borrow 30, but you've got that other facility for housing and making use of that. But that's going to have to either come off your fund if you ever leave the company, or you retire, or you get retrenched, or you die. That'll deduct it from the fund. So you've just got to look at that. There are some further benefits other than the two-pot system, which has always been allowable under pension funds for housing.
All right. Thanks for that, Brian. Let's take these voice notes.
Hi, Cathy and Brian. Thanks for the lovely show. You're speaking to Yoni in North Riding. I have a question. I have a 2-bedroom apartment that I'm currently renting out, but the rent doesn't cover everything. So what I'm paying for the bond and the levies and the rates amounts to 10,000 and something, but I could only rent it out for 8,000. So I am moving away next month to another country, and I was planning on renting it out, but I keep thinking maybe I should sell it, but I can't decide. So I was hoping Brian would give me advice as to what to do maybe with it.
I don't know what equity, in other words, what you've got cash in the property, but I can just mention one thing, that properties are at the lowest. Can they go lower? You've been hearing many of our callers who are struggling, and the problem is, I always say, the bond costs and all the things that owners of a property need to cover in terms of rent. And remember, you may be getting 8,000 and it may be costing you 10. You know, sometime along the line, you've got to cut your losses. You've got to say, well, I've got some equity. I'm going to take the equity, or I'm going to rely on having to. It's such a difficult one because, you know, property prices are so low. But I think, you know, if you say you're moving on, you're going to another country, maybe it's time to cut your losses. Sell the property. Yeah, you won't get the price that you could have got 2 or 3 years ago. Properties are standing. You're actually having to give them away at ludicrous prices, what we call bargain basement prices. But yeah, you've got to consider that. Certainly, you know, when will you be able to cover all the expenses? How long? And remember, it's not just rent versus your costs. It's if you lose a tenant and you've got to replace the tenant and you've got to do maintenance and you've got all the hassles. You've got to look at that carefully. But yes, so many people are cutting their losses because renting property is certainly. But although, let me also say this, it's a terrible time. One doesn't want to sell at the worst possible time, and that's what you're doing with property. You're actually selling at the worst possible time.
All right, so if she can hang on to it a little bit longer, then that's what she must do.
She's got to work out how much is she putting into the property, what is the chance of the property appreciating. I think property is going to take a long time to appreciate. Interest rates are not coming down just yet, and then after they've come down, you know, and there's so much available on the market. You know, a tenant does have no loyalty to the property they live in. They'll move to a property next door if they can get it for less. That's what tenancy is about.
All right. So it sounds like you're just going to have to try and do some of that maths and see if you were to sell that property right now, how much are you likely to get? Will that at least cover the bond that you've taken out for it? If yes, then maybe it's an easier decision. But if no, how long would you be able to hang on for? All right. Sipho, you're out in East London. Good morning.
Good morning, Cathy. Good morning, Brian.
Morning, Sipho.
Yes, it's a great show, by the way.
Thank you.
Brian, I think you covered me in your last regarding selling of the property, because I'm a bit in that situation now between deciding to continue with renting it out or selling it outright, because the prices now are so low, and the advice that I got recently was that this is not a selling market in terms of property. So I think you partly covered me. I would like your maybe now that you've covered me in terms of that one, just to get your comment on this thing of the interest rates. I've read something that is saying there was no need for the Reserve Bank to hike the interest rates. Instead, they could have done another way. So I would like your comment in that part. Do they have to really continue hiking these interest rates? Thank you very much, Brian. I will stop at that.
Well, the Reserve Bank's mandate is to contain inflation. And with inflation moving up to 6 or 7%, in terms of that mandate, whether that mandate's correct or not, and I'm petrified of a whole lot of other economists phoning in. I was of the feel that maybe even though we've got high inflation in South Africa is pushed on us. The petrol price, food prices, transport prices, all pushed on us. It's not as if South Africans are going out and splurging and having the time of their life, and in other words, a demand. We weren't demanding products and goods. It's pushed on us. So, but let me go back to what your question is. Yeah, because of the high inflation rates and because of our fear, although inflation rate last week, our numbers did come down from the month before from 5.6 to 5.3. And then our interest rates are governed very much by what's going on internationally. Our bond rates now are paying anything. Our 2030 bond is paying around about 11.03%. A 5-year government retail bond is paying 11.25. Our 30-year bond, government bond, is paying 13.5%. That's what they're paying to obtain for people to lend their money. So interest rates are going to stay higher for longer. And American interest rates don't look like they first looked like there were going to be 6 cuts this year, then to 3. Now all the commentaries I've been reading yesterday talks about 2, and that's why the interest rates, the U.S. Treasury rates have gone up. They were at 3.8, which sounds low compared to South Africa. They're now closer to 4.8, which is substantially higher. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Interest rates, and Cathy summed it up very well. Cathy made the comment: you do need to do the numbers. I'm not saying to everyone, go out and sell your property because you're underwater, because you're not connecting enough. Understand you can write all your costs off against any income. So from a tax point of view, you're tax neutral and you're actually getting a benefit. And you've got to ride this out. So Cathy made the point. If you can ride it out, then try and ride it out, understanding all the things that come with it, the hassles I spoke about. If you can't ride it out, and remember, property is about position. Owning a property doesn't mean it's in the right area that will appreciate first. So I'm not advocating just go and sell an investment property. Look at it carefully, do your numbers. Take into account a 2-year period. How long will you be funding that property over and above what you're paying in? What is it likely the property to be? What will you likely be able to sell it in 2 years' time? Look at all the numbers before you make that view. But interest rates are going to stay higher for much longer.
All right. Thanks for that, Sipho, out in East London. And I think, Brian, an important point to then probably also talk about, because you were touching on inflation, is the target band for the Reserve Bank, right? What is the target band that they're working on?
The current target band is 3 to 6%. Now, there has been comment that should be maybe lower. Now, if that's lower, then that puts more pressure on interest rates. If it's a bit higher, if the band was, say, 4 to 7%, then we're right in the middle of that already, and we could consider interest rates. But there's so many other factors that go into it, and one of the big factors is what is happening globally. It looks like UK interest rates could start to come down. Japanese rates went up. China, there's also been some adjustment there. Yeah, and that's why when we read markets reports on a daily basis, we talk about the rand. I mean, we just heard about the rand at 19.18. We heard about the oil price at 87. Those two factors tell us what's going to happen with petrol, because the higher the oil price and the lower the value of the rand against the dollar, because we buy up oil in dollars, that means we're probably going to be in for a rate hike come the beginning of May.
Oh, don't say it. Not another one. I saw somebody posting on X the other day, and this individual says, I used to pay 10,000 Rand for my bond. I'm now paying about 18,000 rand for my bond, and they were just complaining about the high cost of living and how they actually can't do it anymore. Because we thought it was just going to be for a period, but that period is turning out to be much longer.
So let me make a comment to that. Your bond cost will come down. I can't tell you when it will come down. Your medical aid cost will keep going up. So on the one hand, if interest rates come down, you get a benefit on the bond, but your medical aid, that's why I talked early on in the program, the dangers of medical aid in 8 and 16 years' time, what's going to happen. You need to carefully look at your whole healthcare program. And that's why we need a universal healthcare system in South Africa. Absolutely. Everyone is entitled to get health services. But at this point in time, the costs and the whole program with NHR is really at the moment not on, simply because there's so many problems that still need to be ironed out.
All right. Let me go to Khojane in Kroonstad. Good morning.
How are you?
Well, thank you, Khojane.
Thank you. I just need advice here. If good morning, Brian.
Good morning, Khojane.
If a person has a stand, or a person has just bought a full stand and he needs to develop the stand, but he doesn't have money, and then he has a house fully paid, he doesn't know anything, would you advise that person to apply for the refinancing of that house to develop this stand to make money, or what would you advise that person to have another source of money to finance the construction on the new site?
Well, Khojane, it depends what you intend putting on the stand, and it depends on the viability of the project. You need to do those numbers. If, let's say, you've got a home and you've got a home worth $1 million and it's got no bond and you're going to borrow 500,000, you need to calculate those costs over the next 5 years. You need to cost the development on the stand, and remember, whatever the price of that development is today, it could be higher, because building costs are increasing all the time. So you've got to do those numbers. You've got to do, you're going in, it's like a business. You're going into a business and you've got to have a business plan. So everyone's circumstance would be different, but a lot of people over the years have been very successful in borrowing on their home and then making the stand. But you've got to understand that project is viable and where it is and what it's going to do, and also their time delays. So you need to do those numbers. You need to look at this on a 5 to 10 year project basis to see how it works out, and you can take into account interest rates will come down on your bond, and once you've got that up, you've got to work out what rentals you can get, what the costs are, what agents will be involved in helping you find a tenant. It's a business plan, Khojane, and in many cases over the years people have been very successful in doing that. The one big advantage is interest rates will come down, and so if you're taking a bond on your property, then fortunately the cost of your bond will come down. I mean, Cathy was just telling a story about someone paying 10,000 years ago, now paying 18,000. I think we've come to the end of rate tightening, and I think rates will come down. So if you're looking at it over the next 3 to 5 years, do the feasibility, work out what you're going to put on that stand, work out what rental you're going to get after all the costs, and then do the calculation of how much extra the bond is costing you.
Okay. If I understand you correctly, if the numbers are good, then you can look for the refinance.
Absolutely. If the numbers are good, but also, don't be too optimistic about the stand and the property. Be realistic. It's all about being realistic, not be looking at South Africans are either super optimists or the pessimistic of all. Look at it practically and do the numbers. Yeah.
All right. Khojane, thanks. Let's leave it there. Salumani, good morning.
Morning. Hi, guys. I just have a situation where my calculations show me that in the next 2 years, barring nothing happens, if financially I keep on saving the amount of money I'm saving, in 2 years' time, I will be able to actually reach my balance of the bond and settle my bond. But I'm caught up in a situation where being liquid and settling your bond, like the benefits. I mean, if I save up this amount of money, obviously I would have never had this amount of money in my account ever before. It's an amount that obviously I'll be like, okay, should I, after saving after so much effort saving this money, and then in a one EFT transaction, there it goes, settling the bond. Does it make sense to settle a bond or just being liquid at the moment?
Salami, let me put it this way. Your bond is costing you somewhere between 11 and 12%. I don't know, 0.25% above prime will cost you 12, 0.75% below prime will cost you 11. You're not getting 11% in your money market account. You're getting a lot less. And you've got to pay tax on that interest. So for me, to settle a bond at this point in time makes all sense. One thing you need to know, if you've got an access bond and you put it into your bond and you're able to take the money out if you need it for a project or something that could make money for you, then that's an opportunity. But I'm absolutely in agreement to settle bonds at these high rates because you're not getting these rates after tax on savings you're making.
Yeah, no. Thank you. You've settled it for me.
Okay. And congratulations, Salomani. Sounds like you're on the right track, eh? Lots of discipline.
Thanks,
all right. Kevin, you're in Cape Town. Good morning.
Good morning. So I've got a question about UIF. My wife passed away about 2 months ago. She's been working for the company for 11 years. So what happens to that UIF? Can I claim for it or what? Does it just disappear?
Salami, you know, I once said there was a show.
We're talking to Kervin now.
Oh, Kervin, sorry.
Yes.
Kervin, there was a show on radio, SABC show called, the Quiz Kids. And if you stumped the Quiz Kids, you got a little accolade. You've stumped me. I don't know the answer. So now what I need to do is, so your wife passed away 2 months ago. She was in she was in employment.
Yes.
And you want to know what the story is. Can our producer please take your phone number down, and I will get I will get the answer for you and call you back during the course of the week.
Okay.
All right,
okay.
Kevin. Thanks for that, and
nice.
Of course,
See, it's nice to get stumped because it's like the lawyers. The lawyers only know. They say, "Look at all the books in my office," but I only know 10% of what's in those books. But I know where to find it. I've also got the same story.
Okay.
Okay.
As long as you know where to find the answers, Brian.
Yeah.
So, a question from Mfuleni, and it goes to your point around the increasing cost of medical aid. I mean, listen to this. He pays 13,500 rand medical aid. 13,500 rand medical aid. But he says that the medical aid only paid 36% of his son's claim, and he now owes 8,000. And he's asking, what are the tax implications of this?
Well, he didn't give me his age, and so if you're under age 65, you don't get many tax benefits. You get what's called a tax credit. If you're over 65, you are able to write off some of those costs. There's a formula, and about 30% of what you pay is paid off. That's the problem with medical aids, by the way. People also need to understand one thing about medical aid. What are your co-payments, and what does the medical aid not have? I had a problem over the Easter weekend. I needed to have a scan. The scan was 15,000 rand. I got a phone call today to say my medical aid only paid 11. I've got to pay 3,600 rand outstanding. I didn't even know that. It just goes to show so often tests are done you don't even know. All I can say is one other tip is most of the medical aids have what's called network doctors who are contracted to the medical aid, and you pay medical aid rates. I know it may not be comfortable because so many people have got their doctors they've had for years, but if the doctors that are not contracted in to the medical aid, you're paying 4 to 5 times the cost of what the medical aid is paying, and that's one way you can cut back. I'm really, I can't help you on that, but other than you've made the point. And then I made the point that your medical aid in 8 to 9 years won't be 13,500. It'll be 27,000.
Sure. It's unthinkable. Another message from Anonymous here. It says, I've been looking after my mother financially since my dad died in 2012. We're 5 siblings, but only my brother, when he can, and I look after her financially. It's getting harder and harder. I don't have enough money to look after my own retirement future because of all the other financial burdens that I have. It's very scary, but what can we do?
Well, the starting point is you were looking after your mother after your father died from 2012. That's 12 years. You were able to. You and your brother, you mentioned your brother, when he could help. You've now got to sit down with your siblings and say, guys, I can no longer do this. And it's tough because the onus can't only be on you. The onus has to be shared, however small it may be. You need that discussion with your siblings. You did what you could while you could, but you can't any longer. It's tough love. You have to do it. What can you do? Because you now jeopardize who's going to look after you when you get to retirement. So you need to look at that.
Okay. All right. Very difficult conversations indeed, right? And sometimes I know that people also live with the guilt of just starting that conversation in the first place. Especially, I think, I don't know if it's any more difficult in black families, Brian.
It's no different.
It's the same, hey.
You know, Cathy, everyone in South Africa is struggling, no matter who you are, where you are, because people have set a standard of a certain standard, and if that standard gets affected, on the concept of stress, the most stressful thing in the barometer is the loss of a child. The second most stressful is losing your job and having to move your family. Sure. And having to downsize. That is the second most stressful thing on that barometer. So these are difficult issues. Let me quickly give my number: 011 880 4888, 011 880 4888. All your phone numbers, your question, and I'll try and get back to you. If not, I'll get someone from my office to call you.
Bye, Brian. Up next, news.
In our top stories, cocaine worth 15 million rand seized at Richards Bay Port and pro-Palestinian protests across U.S. college campuses. Good morning. We start with news just in. The city of Tshwane's former mayor, Murunwa Makwarela, has died. The city has confirmed he died this morning after a short illness. Makwarela was appointed mayor in February 2023 to replace Randall Williams. However, his time in office was short-lived following controversy related to being declared insolvent in 2016, making him ineligible for public office. The Hawks have confiscated cocaine with a street value of 15 million rand on board a cargo vessel after it docked at the Richards Bay port from Colombia. The KwaZulu-Natal Hawks spokesperson, Simpiwe Mhlongo, says the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency notified South African authorities about it. The vessel was transporting iron to South Africa. Various entities, including port security and customs officials, took part in an operation which led to the confiscation. Mhlongo says law enforcement officials are still inspecting the vessel.
The Hawks members from Richards Bay serious organized crime were contacted by the external stakeholder, which is the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, about this ship which they were monitoring along the sea. It was coming from Colombia to South Africa.
The Senzo Mehiwa murder trial has continued in the High Court in Pretoria. Yesterday, the Defence Counsel, Tulani Mgomezulu, accused the investigating team of covering up the real perpetrator. 5 men are on trial for gunning down the Bafana Bafana captain in October 2014. Mgomezulu claims Longwe Twala fired the shot that killed Mehiwa. He accused the investigating team of protecting the perpetrator, something that Sergeant Mukhola rejected. Some beneficiaries of the Labour Activation Programme, which the Employment and Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi launched in Bloemfontein yesterday, are excited. The aim of the programme is to empower young people by giving them skills to make them employable. These beneficiaries say they are getting valuable skills.
I'm being student under FTC and UIF. We're going to complete at 16 May 2024. As plumbers, we were taught about domestic plumbing, about how to fix the taps, fix sewages, drainage, blockage. There's a lot that we have learned, and we are willing to utilize whatever we learned.
So I'm assistant chef there. When I started this program, it taught me a lot about decision making and working under pressure.
The city of Tshwane says power will be restored to some parts of Pretoria East tomorrow. This after a fire destroyed a transformer at the Mooikloof substation last week, leaving residents without power. The city's member of the Mayoral Committee for Utilities, Timba Fosi.
There is communication that is being sent through the ward councillors to all the respective wards that have been affected. We are still on our commitment of restoration by Wednesday evening on a phased approach, with a certain group being powered up. Once the levels of stress are being maintained, we can be able to move another group again up until everyone in the region has some sort of power.
And finally, campus demonstrations in the U.S. against the war in Gaza have spread from Columbia and Yale to other universities as officials attempt to calm a growing movement. Yesterday, police broke up a protest at New York University. The university said it received reports of intimidation, chants and anti-Semitism, but protest groups say their criticism is not anti-Semitic and is reserved for the Israeli state and its supporters. The student was among the demonstrators at Emerson College in Boston.
We want Emerson College, number one, call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Number two, to disclose all financial investments in Zionist organizations. Number three, to divest from those organizations. Number four, to drop all charges against students for disciplinary actions.
Recapping the top story, the city of Tshwane's former mayor Murunwa Makwarela has died. The city has confirmed he died this morning after a short illness. For SFM News, I am Anne Musa.
Here, there, and everywhere. SAFM 105.1 FM in Johannesburg. The Full Circle with Bridget Masinga.
Do you know how they became lost and how they were ultimately recovered almost 30 plus years later?
We were invited as a group of artists from Namibia, Rwanda, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa together to exhibit at Stockholm in 1989 to say your thoughts are now understood. Bring the works and we will exhibit it and get you a press.
That was Helen Mahabo, Helen Siberi.
The Full Circle with Bridget Masinga, Monday to Friday, 1 to 3 p.m. Let's have the conversation. WhatsApp voice notes on 0614 104 107.
Morning, Cathy. This time from Bloemfontein. Is there any way that we can stop this spam calls? I can't take it anymore, my sister. Really, I'm focusing at work. They will call non-stop. You block them, they call with a different number. You block this number again, they call with different. Almost a day, I'm receiving 15 calls of spam calls. Is there any way we can stop them? Or is there any way that I can say, please don't call this number, I'm not interested in your services? Even if you open your data, you open an app, you have to watch this advert before you can use the app. How can we stop this? These people are abusing us.
Hi, this is Mozungiti at Mkambatini Makongo. What I like to talk about right now, I like to talk about all these workers that are working under the government department or municipalities to in source. There are many cleaners that they're working many years, and they are private security officers that they working just more than 15 years, in the government premises. But the municipality, they don't look on them, when there is a time for employee of them, But now, we like to say, eThekwini municipality and Msunduzi municipality, they must insource all these private sectors and private security officers, I like to say, I thank you.
Good morning, Sis Cathy and your team, Jumbo Africa. Sis Cathy, I'm also disappointed about our government, about the issue of Guyana. The residents of Guyana, they are struggling with water. Our government, they keep looting money, something normal. But now I'm not surprised if they can say they have a case in SIU. SIU is a useless entity that we have in South Africa. Since SIU he was established, they never even arrest one person. So it's just waste of time and waste our energy. So I don't have a doubt that SIU will keep failing us, but it's fine. SIU is for Ramaphosa. Everyone can sit his pace in Matosan.
The Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday.
It's 10 after 11 o'clock. Welcome to the third and final hour of the show. Yeah, look, Percy, in terms of the SIU, don't forget that much of the work that they do is really around civil matters, right, and being able to get back monies that have been ill-gotten. The true work of the prosecuting really lies with the prosecution authorities, which is the NPA and the investigative directorates, the Hawks. So, yeah, it just sometimes they do the best that they can under the circumstances. Well, our final conversation of this morning is focusing on on universal basic income and the question really around its implementation in South Africa. Where are we with that conversation now? Nomadlubi Jakuja is head of research at the Social Policy Initiative. Nomadlubi, good morning to you. Thanks for your time this morning.
Good morning, Cathy. It's a pleasure to be on SAFM and to have your listeners listening to us and what we have to say. Thank you.
Russell Wilderman is a social policy specialist at the United Nations Children's Fund. Russell, good morning.
Good morning, Cathy, and fantastic to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to participate, and good morning to your listeners as well.
Nomadlubi, let me kick it off with you. When we look, I guess, just more broadly at the conversation around a universal basic income, it seems that the conversation in South Africa has moved quite far. And what I mean by that is that activists and people like yourselves that have really been at the forefront of initiating the need for some form of basic income in the country have done well to not only bring this conversation to the fore, but have it be a conversation that now also finds itself, spoken about in the corridors of our national treasury, in the corridors of the presidency. So there has been this elevation around the need for a basic income. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, Cathy. And I think it stems from not just even the social policy initiative, but the people and the voices in the space. And also globally, there has been a wide recognition of a universal social security safety net. And this is indicative of the platforms where SPY has been invited to sit on, including the Universal Social Security Network, which is based in the US, as well as BN in the UK, and also the Amplifying Voices for Africa, which is a regional platform of think tanks, where really the need for universalism in our approach to social security has been amplified. And I think looking uniquely in South Africa, it's also just recognizing the high unemployment levels. And while a universal basic income grant is not a replacement for job creation, but it is a question of how do people in the meantime, while they are unemployed and looking for employment, how can we as a state and a society afford them a life of dignity where they at least can become active participants in the economy? And that said, at looking at social policy differently, where it actually can be used and has been used by many different countries to stimulate an economic activity.
Russell, do you get the sense that even from a policy perspective, we are closer to the implementation of a basic income grant? And I say that because we look at the implementation of the social relief of distress grant. That started, of course, under COVID. It was meant to be a once-off, but it has stayed with us, and it's still with us today. One doesn't know what's going to happen after the 29th of May, but that in and of itself, can we see that as an indication of the recognition for the need for such a grant in our society?
Cathy, thank you so much for the question. I think both Norma and I and yourself will agree that we do need an intervention. We are sitting with record levels of hunger among women and children. So it is inevitable that South Africa needs to make a constructive and positive decision about how do we approach what many of us consider to be a calamity. It's worrying, it's difficult, and from a human-centered point of view and a child rights-centered point of view, it is vital that we need to look at the most weakest, of our constituencies. That being said, I don't see a complete national consensus on what needs to be done. Everyone is saying something needs to be done, but there's no national consensus yet about whether the intervention specifically is indeed the universal basic income or some form of universal basic income support, or whether there's going to be a mix of different kinds of interventions. Clearly, from an official policy perspective, we had the consistent sort of deferral of big decisions around universal basic income, and therefore the continuation. That situation reads to me more like uncertainty, reads to us more like a firmer decision needs to be taken that is supported, I think, by the political elite, by the political class, and by civil society, and by everyone concerned. Because I think it's not clear to us where this is going to land. Just by way of an example, people are talking about the crisis of funding in basic education. People are talking about the necessity of implementing the national health insurance. So where do all of these different things land? Where Norma and I and SPA and UNICEF consistently agree is that we definitely need a very constructive and positive intervention at this point in time. Whether that's the UBI, it's still an open question as far as we are concerned, because we don't dictate policy to the South African government. We're here to support the South African government in what it is trying to do. Cathy?
Let's talk about what is happening in the rest of the world when it comes to social interventions, especially by way of a protection net that is required. In this country, Nomakhlubi, we're dealing with what is the highest level of inequality. And really what that means is that if there's any income that an individual is earning, whether it's by way of a temporary job or even a permanent job, their life and their experience of life in South Africa is radically different to that of somebody who is not employed. And when we look at those numbers, we are talking about millions of people in this country, the majority of whom are young people, the majority of whom are also women.
Absolutely. Just to quote a very horrific stat, just looking at the expanded definition alone, 72% of young women between the ages of 18 and 34 in South Africa, Black, are unemployed. And I think where at least some of the lessons we can learn from developed countries, especially if you look at the Nordic countries, is the orientation and the thinking around the paradigm around social security and grants, where it's seen as a collective for bettering the economy and society. Whereas in South Africa, we have created, and we should take responsibility as academics as well, where there's been theories of dependency theory concerning social security, where there's this narrative that if you are on a grant in South Africa, you are less than, you are being handicapped in some form of way. And while that is true in a sense, the handicap part, because you are excluded out of the economy, but we've turned it into a very negative connotation and a very negative thing to be on a grant in South Africa. But I think the narrative and the case for something like a universal basic income is the fact that it's not only meant to support people that are handicapped or excluded, but it's going to be for everyone. And while we've done the numbers, only we anticipate a 70% uptake because people have a preference of choosing jobs over being on a grant. But the case is, while people are looking for jobs, they have money for transport, they have money for data to do the interviews, to actively participate. And if someone is a graduate and has the opportunity to do online interviews, they can do it. And it's a way of bettering our society and making sure that we don't live in a society of haves and have-nots, especially where the contrast is very stark in South Africa's case.
On the issue of dependency, there are those who believe that, if we spend whatever money would be allocated towards a basic income grant, then we're not only increasing and building a welfare state, but that money would be better spent creating or helping to create jobs.
I think the discourse we've always tried to avoid, it's not an either or. And even in our policy, in my research, and many other researchers, we do say a UBI would be one of 7 pillars that need to be in place. And what a UBI will do immediately is to inject money into an economy in South Africa. I had a meeting 2 weeks ago with the head of the IMF in Washington, D.C., where the region as a whole is expected to grow in the next year by 4%, but South Africa is only expected to grow by 1.4% in terms of GDP. So what a UBI will immediately do, it will put money into cash into the hands of people who will spend in the economy. But that said, if you look at just the food example, we need to make sure, which is the bulk of what the UBI recipients will be using it on, to make sure they have day-to-day food requirements, transport, etc. But if I just zone in on the food sector and some of the elements that need to accompany a UBI, South Africa will need to make sure, for example, if a large proportion of the UBI recipients are spending on canned beans, South Africa will need to make sure that they are producing those beans in the country and they're not exporting them, to make sure that we actually get the benefits of that injection into the economy. And these are the 7 pillars we say that need to, because then that speaks to our industrial policy that need to accompany a UBI. It speaks to South Africa becoming actually a net exporter of food and not a net importer. And these are some of the UBI, for me at least, where the biggest value has been. It opens up these discourses and discussions into our economic policy, an economic codesa that we actually never had as an economy. We may not all agree that a UBI is the solution, but it is a way that forces us to think and recognize that we need to speak about our economy that has excluded a large proportion of young people in a continent that's predominantly young. We need to talk about the fact that we never had an economic codesa, and that the benefits have largely not been felt in economic prosperity in South Africa by the majority of citizens. What can we do? And there are short-term policies like a UBI, and even at SPI, we propose a UBI for 3 years. After that 3 years, and while we even start with policies like UBI to just revitalize the economy and to kickstart it, it needs a change in our industrial policy. It needs a relook at our infrastructure development and stuff. And these are not things that are either or. They need to be happening at the same time. We need a holistic approach to it.
Russell, The conversation around what form this social protection should take is also an important one, right? What are the other models that we see in different parts of the world? So sometimes you'll hear people say, well, does it actually have to be cash, in people's pockets or people's bank accounts? So if you had the same thinking and said, well, if this is to largely deal with poverty and the fact that we have people that go to bed hungry, why not create a coupon system like they have in the US? So you would know better about what it is that some countries are doing in response to similar challenges.
I think, Cathy, there's an international consensus that it is infinitely better to give somebody cash, because I think it's based on the philosophical principle that as human beings, there's a level of autonomy that needs to be respected. In South Africa, for example, if you look at the child support grant, most of the caregivers are female-headed households, or females who are in possession of this particular grant for their specific children. And study upon study in the South African context has actually demonstrated that women have made the best possible decisions. They haven't spent the money on alcohol or on cigarettes, as some people would allege. Look, there's some anecdotal evidence, but that's not scientific evidence. The evidence seems to suggest that you can successfully do a cash transfer program, and those who pick up and those who participate in the program tend to spend the money wisely, judiciously. And the South African government, to its credit, has never imposed any conditions on the receipt of a social assistance intervention or social grant. So I think if we were to go that way into the future, I think it would be recommended. If you look at the rest of the continent, for example, the rest of the continent is copying South Africa. South Africa is way ahead in terms of where our particular social assistance systems are, Cathy. If you even look at Brazil, for example, Brazil has a very strong cash transfer system. So cash transfers work. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Money in the hands of ordinary South Africans are not spent on malicious things, on things which are harmful to children or harmful to the community as such. You would have exceptions, but those exceptions do not define the norm. In terms of linking it to some form of condition or conditionality, I think that had been explored, at least in terms of ideas in the South African context. In other words, if somebody is receiving a child support grant, can we make sure that that particular child is actually participating in basic education, or that child is actually accessing the necessary health services which are provided by the National Department of Health? But I do think that from a pure public finance point of view, when you think about a cash transfer, you think about transfers. Now, a transfer by its very definition increases the autonomy of a person receiving it, increases the purchasing power of a person receiving it. That's why civil society is always up in arms about the need to make sure that cash transfers actually keep pace with inflation, so that the discretionary buying power that sits with the person receiving the grant remains, et cetera, et cetera. So from our point of view, there's no need to invent a complicated system of coupons or whatever the case may be. Once you put hands into a responsible adult, a responsible caregiver, as has been proved over and over again in the South African context, they will make the best, and they do make the best possible decisions around children. I mean, if you look at what the Department of Social Development is doing, Cathy, that's a very good example. What they have done was to link those who receive the child support grant, to link them to, for example, higher education. So an increasingly larger proportion of students entering tertiary education are actually coming off a grant system. So there's no fundamental objection to the fact that a cash transfer is actually a meaningful intervention in a society that is so desperate, becoming so fragile. And of course, we cannot possibly predict what the post-election situation is going to look like. But I would assume that there would still be a national consensus that we have to, at least with the present social assistance system, continue and perhaps even improve that system. But we can come back to the whole idea of the UBI, but definitely cash transfers in the hands of ordinary South Africans. Cathy?
Russell, you still have a number of people, and it could be primarily as a result of the myths and misunderstandings associated with social welfare and grants in particular. But you still have people that believe that giving cash incentivizes, in inverted commas, and I use that word begrudgingly because I know what the research says, but they believe that it incentivizes people to then not look for jobs. It incentivizes young girls to fall pregnant because they'll access the grant.
Yeah, Cathy, if you look at the size of the grants, there's a built-in incentive within the grants that the grants will never be adequate to sustain a decent standard of living. The best example of that came when COVID-19 hit all of us. And the rate of poverty and the rate of hunger started climbing dramatically because prior to COVID-19, before the economy was locked down, those who were receiving grants were in a position to look for any kind of job, patch jobs, scratch jobs, whatever you call it. Everyone has a fundamental right to make a living. And grant recipients often have to supplement the grant income just to be able to live and just to be able to feed the family for the entire month. So we never really had a grant situation in South Africa where the monetary value of the grant is so large that it completely disincentivizes people to go and look for work. And I think that's a fundamental point. It's almost like a built-in incentive because you want to strike a balance between giving somebody a cash transfer, but at the same time, as Norma so beautifully and eloquently put out, create the environment where things are a bit better for people to start accessing jobs and accessing work opportunities. But we don't, at this point in time, have a grant system where you can comfortably say, if I'm in receipt of this particular grant, I don't need to do anything else.
All right.
People are still hustling.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you,
We'll
Cathy.
continue the conversation in a moment. I see a number of you already lined up to contribute. We'll do that after the latest headlines.
With the headlines at 11:30, I am Dino Mutaung. Good morning. Messages of condolences are pouring in for the family of the former Tshwane Executive Mayor Morono Makwarela. He died this morning after a short illness. In other news, the Limpopo government spokesperson Ndabe Ramakwela has been charged with contravening a section of the Tax Administrative Act, and the Hawks have confiscated cocaine with a street value of 15 million rand on board a cargo vessel after it docked at the Richards Bay port from Colombia. A full update follows at the top of the hour.
The Chill Zone with Bertha Charuma.
And you are referred to as The Voice. How did this come about?
I was given the name The Voice because of my singing voice and bringing the message, but I was also called Teacher. But I remember also the other name that I sort of like said, no. I don't want that I should have a name that they will recognize easily. I would call myself Isuf Al-Salaham. That is when you check Mahlasela from the last to the start. Mahlasela becomes Al-Salaham. Vusi becomes Isuf.
Vusi Mahlasela, the legendary guitarist, singer-songwriter.
Sticks and stones and the UN loan and passport.
Bertha Charuma, Fridays. The National Pulse with Ashraf Garda.
90 gender-based violence cases were struck off the court rolls primarily because of police negligence. What do you make of that statement? How true is it?
Sadly, we have a compromised recruitment requirement for police officers. You cannot have a police officer who we expect one day will go to court and be a credible witness when they do not have a requisite or rather a basic level of education. And because the recruitment standards are so low, what you necessarily tell the police officer is not what ends up in the statement.
Advocate Intabiseng Sepanya Mohlahlana, the chairperson of the Commission for Gender Equality.
The National Pulse, weekdays, 3 to 6 p.m. The Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana, weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday.
We continue the conversation on the talking point. We're looking at universal basic income. Of course, in South Africa, it's been coined under the basic income grant, which is a work that many activists and social groups have been part of to try and advocate for the need for universal basic income in this country. Nomatlubi Jaguja is one of our guests alongside Russell Wilderman. I'm going to go to the phone lines and take some of your contributions to this conversation. Olani, you're calling from the Eastern Cape. Good morning.
Hi, Cathy.
Hi.
The issue of the basic income grant, it's got its advantages and disadvantages. I'm from the Eastern Cape, considered the most poorest province, and yes, it's supposed to have the potential to be the most productive province. If we were to look at the resources that the province has, we've got the coast, we've got the forests, we've got the rivers. When you talk about water shortages, the Eastern Cape is not supposed to have that type of thing. We've got so much water going to the oceans, and it's not put into there. But your guest, Nomashubi, said something very important about the issues of infrastructure that maybe needs to be looked at. If the basic income grant has no conditions, no limits, we will find a situation where we have permanent dependability that leads to what I would term unconscious slavery. If we don't look into that, an ordinary example, a family where there is a couple, if it's Kolani and someone else, then there should be a limit of how many children must be supported by the state to avoid a situation where Kolani and his partner can then now all of a sudden continue to breed children knowing that the state is going to support. That is one of the things that the state needs to look at in terms of how do you limitize the number. You're not limitizing people from having children. You're limitizing the number of children that the people want to be supported by the state. So it needs to have that space where there are conditions, where they will be managed and controlled. And at the same time, the state allow infrastructure so that those who've got skills will do so, because if they start to pump money to many people who are not working, the issues of demand and supply that is from a productive space, you will find that now the prices continue to rise. Why? Because the demand is increasing, and then there is money for the for the producers. So prices continue to rise because people will all be having this minimum amount to spend. That's my take on it.
So, Polani, just to understand, in terms of the limits that you have in mind, is it a limit that says if you have parents in a household that are on the basic income grant potentially, then the children that they have cannot receive the social grant, or that they can but up to a certain age, or what?
What should be happening is that the number of children that, even if it's any family that receives basic income grant or not, those that are eligible, there should be a limit. If you say we can, in this couple, have only 3 children that will be supported for the grant, because if then they continue to have many more children, and yet they know that they don't have source of income to support, then you are increasing, you are creating a situation where dependency becomes this unconscious slavery that you're going to have everybody else wanting to depend on the state.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Tolani, thanks for the point. I'll get our guests to respond in a moment. Colin in Cape Town, good morning.
Good morning, and good morning to your guest. Tolani took the words out of my mouth. Yeah. These young, especially the young girls, limit the grant amount, because they've got 1, they get a grant. 2, 3, 4, 5. I see them. I travel around in Cape Town here. I see them. I see 2, 3, 4, all on grants. And you know something? Your guest and the experts must get into cars and ride around in the cities not the cities actually, in the suburbs and see what goes on round about the 2nd of each month to the 5th. You'll be surprised to see how many people, women under the influence and men under the influence of alcohol round about 2, 3 o'clock the afternoon, lying under bridges, lying here, swearing at each other, using foul languages. They've spent that money that they just received from the post office. Now, that is the problem. And the government also to blame. We import more than what we can even export and sell. We need infrastructure, we need factories, we need skilled workers, training people, plumbers, electricians, boilermakers, you name it. We need people in this country to do skill work, because that is where these people can find jobs and employ themselves as a plumber, as an electrician, whatever, as a welder, whatever it is. The government must look and make up their minds and employ these people, train them. I wouldn't want 350 rand if I know the government's going to train me for a job. To hang with the 350 rand. I want a job. I don't want handouts.
Okay.
These experts must realize one thing. People don't want handouts, they want jobs. We need building factories. We import from China all our clothing, our leather, our steel. We sell our steel and iron ore and manganese to China. We buy it back again. What is going on with this government? The old government never did that. We melted, we used all our minerals, and we had steel, we had ISCO, we had foundries, we had everything in this country. The manufacturing industry has disappeared since this government came into power, and your guests know it. Thanks very much.
Okay, all right. Colin, out in Cape Town. Look, I guess a lot of things have changed about the country, but I'll stick to the point that you're making when it comes to the manufacturing sector and perhaps part of the regression that has been noted there. Dumile, you are in Ekala. Good morning.
Good morning, Cathy, and the panel.
Yes.
I think what I want to say, some of the guys have touched up on it, but I think one thing we might be missing is that, when you help someone physically, you also need to help them emotionally. What I want to get to is that as much as we do have policies, our policies don't seem to have a soul, and the soul that you can transfer to the actual implementers of the policy. I'll make an example. If, for instance, you come to SASSA and SASSA is giving their people money, is there an office that somehow advises people on how, not necessarily to tell people or direct them how to use money, but just to give them a conscious understanding of how to use the little money that they are getting from SASSA? Like this simple example of NESA, a student who got 40 million rand by mistake and spent 80 million rand just splashing. Now, not to say that person at that age with all the background they have couldn't have done that. But I believe with counseling and debriefing of their situation, especially if you consider the fact that now you are going to give them money that they have not worked for and they still have traumatic problems that relate to how they handle money. And if you don't deal with those things, then you have situations where people say people are given money and they drink it. Yes, they drink it. We see it, and academics can deny it. But we people living here in rural areas, we know this thing. It's like, when we have sisters, not that they drink all of them, but they drink some of it. So you can't deny all these things. And I think academics need to really speak to, not sympathize a lot. Yes, sympathy is fine, but we need to speak to the reality of the situation so that we can find the actual solution.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
It's very serious. Yeah,
okay. All right, Dumile, thanks for that contribution. Russell, let me kick it off with you.
Thank you, Cathy. First of all, in response to Dumile's question, some time back we actually did a pilot or participated in a pilot with the University of Johannesburg, where they actually took recipients of the child support grant and then had a complementary system of people who were trained to teach caregivers financial decision-making within the household, what's the best way of looking after your children, et cetera, et cetera. And although it was at piloting stage and it's not yet been extended to the broader South African system, there would be an idea, there would be acceptance that you can actually establish alongside the receipt of the grant some form of formal education to those who are receiving the grants. This doesn't gainsay, I think, the reality that grants are normally used very productively. There's always a bit of what we call perception bias. So when you see things with your eyes, you may think that's the national pattern, not necessarily the case. Because you haven't actually observed, you've observed one small part of a community, and then you come to a fundamental conclusion that people are not using grants constructively or productively. So I think we need to take that into account. Then quickly, just in terms of Colin's point, I think this is the point. I think this point will better be explained by Norma, where we're trying to avoid this sharp contradiction or the sharp opposition between giving cash in somebody's hand and building the productive investment or the productive infrastructure of the country. So you may ask Norma maybe to speak to that a bit more. And then in terms of limiting the number of children, if they are your biological children, of course, in terms of the existing child support grant, it cannot be limited. But if you take, for example, responsibility for children who are not your biological children, then I think you limit it to 6 children who can actually qualify for the child support grant. So there are limitations, but not necessarily on biological children, because obviously it will raise constitutional and ethical issues if some of the children in the household are receiving grants and other children are not receiving, because it's a human rights issue, basically. So let me stop at that point, Cathy. Maybe ask Norma to intercede.
All right, Norma Louis.
Thank you so much. I think I enjoy these debates because they really allow us to debunk some myths. So when we make policy, we never make policy, we do a statistical model and we look at the 75% of the population, and the population being everyone in South Africa. You never want to make policy because based on the 25%, which we call them outliers. And those outliers can be the ones that are negatively spending the grants, or on the other end of the spectrum that are really have turned the policy, as we've done in our documentary. We went into communities to find out how they actually spending the 350 grants, and some of them were starting businesses. It's now a big ice cream creamery initiative. So you don't look at the two extremes, you look at what the 75% of the population is doing. And there has been no research that the 75% of the population are misusing cash transfers and grants. So that's what we based the policy on. It's not to say there aren't people on both ends of the extremes misusing grants or using them for exceptional cases to start a business to compete with Paul's Ice Cream in Soweto. So you take the average 75%, what are they doing? Are they doing are they spending it on food, which has been the case that the 75%, which is we tend to say majority, but it doesn't mean everyone, but it means the people that are in that 75% spectrum use it for good, or at least what the policy is intended for. And then just on the cash versus jobs discourse, we're not saying a UBI, and I think the caller made it so well that you could hear the urgency in the voice that they want jobs. And we're not saying a UBI is replacing jobs, but it's an enabler. If that boilermaker wants to get to school to get the skills training, but has no income at the moment, is unemployed, doesn't even have money for transport, this is where a UBI, it's like such a small spec enabler that they actually, instead of having to borrow and convince a family member to give them transport money, but it gives them that urgency and that autonomy to have money that's coming in from the government every month, and they can use it for transport to get to the skills training facility, to get to the job. But and even the amount itself, how we work it out, as Russell said previously, it's never going to incentivize anyone to stay on that grant as opposed to looking for a job. And again, this is the 75% of people, but there are outliers in each policy-making scenario.
All right, Norma Louis, Russell, let me thank you both for your time and your contributions to this conversation. A big thank you, as always, to our listeners too. We will continue the conversation tomorrow between 9 and midday. Up next is the book reading, and of course, you can stay tuned to SAFM. Certainly, lots of engaging conversations throughout the day.
Freedom Month on SAFM. The month in which we had our first democratic election 30 years ago. This Freedom Month, as we reflect on the progress made thus far, we continue to commemorate the selfless sacrifices made for our democracy and freedom. SAFM, leading the conversation.
The book reading. Please note the views expressed in this book are not that of the station. Listeners' discretion is advised. SAFM presents another episode of Why Men Hate Women, written by Kopano Ratile.
If it is true that men's love can be traced back to the love they did not receive or to conditional love they received from their own families when they were young, the real antithesis of violence is consistent, unconditional loving care. A weak criminal justice system or lack of government violence prevention programs will exacerbate men's violence. Surely, in such conditions, violence will not be prevented or reduced. But loving care coming from fathers, alongside mothers, the extended family, and societal institutions around the person, especially in childhood, will keep boys connected to others and presumably prevent them from turning into violent men. Instead of more policing, harsher sentences, larger prisons, and higher electrified security fences and walls, it is likely that low levels of violence will be achieved and will stay low as a result of increased caring for each other, of our loving attachment. The death of a father, it could be said, is a preferable reason to be fatherless. That is, if a choice is to be made between losing him to death or through desertion. Perhaps it makes difference to a child who needs to be cared for each passing day by a present father and mother. Perhaps not. But have you ever had a 3-year-old ask, why is Dad not coming back? Why did he die? It seems that most children who grow up without a father around have to be helped to deal with this absence in their lives. No one hungers for male love more than the little girl or a boy, writes Bell Hooks. I understand that to mean that all children yearn to be loved forever by their fathers, not just by their mothers. It implies that prior to knowing how to love others as adults, children need to be shown